Hey guys, this is Tech Howdy. I welcome you to another video tutorial where we are building this CMS application using ASP.NET Core 3 and Angular 10. In the last video tutorial, we implemented the display or the view of all the users in our application. We are using tabulator to display the list of these users, and the admin can perform CRUD operations on this view on individual users or can add new users. If you haven't watched that video tutorial, I recommend you to watch it. In this video tutorial, we will be focusing on the user role section. We will be creating a user role section where we will be adding new roles in our application. We will be adding permission types for our role, and we will be adding roles under the user roles. Please know that in this video tutorial series, we will not be implementing these roles or the functionality for these roles. We will only be adding these roles to our application. Our application does not cover the user role implementing feature in this video tutorial series. We will do that in the next phase when we implement blogging and we implement products and ordering in our application. For now, we are just going to leave the roles as it is after we have added them to the membership system or to our application. So to implement the user roles, we need to implement the user role views in our application. We have already added the user role controller. If we go to the application, we had already created the user role controller, but we are yet to implement the logic. So we will go ahead and do that in this video tutorial. So without wasting any further time, let's go ahead and start working on the user controller. Like we always do for the admin area section, we authorize the controllers by adding a authorization attribute over the controller class so that this class functionality is only limited to the admin user. We have created a authentication scheme that we use to implement this authorization level. So we'll go ahead and add the missing references that we need so that we get rid of these errors. So now after we have added these authorized attribute or authorized filter, we will go ahead and start instantiating the required objects using dependency injection. So let's go ahead and start injecting these dependencies in this class. So I have instantiated the required objects. We will require an instance of our user service, the cookie service, instance of our service provider to access these services, an instance of data protection keys so that we can access the keys that we will require to decrypt the cookies, an instance of app settings so that we can get access to the app settings section. We would also need the admin base view model so that we can inject it in the view. And finally, we will need the writable service to make changes to the site-wide settings. Now in the user role controller, we will go ahead and instantiate these objects using dependency injection. Whatever objects we have over here, we have already added them to the middleware, that is the startup class. So we should have no errors while we try to access these objects over here in the controller. Now let's go ahead and start implementing the required methods that we need. So I've implemented the required methods. We would require two methods, one which returns the index view and one which returns the partial view. We have to create this partial view, so we will go ahead and create it. But before that, let's pay attention to the index method that is returning the index view. Here we are returning the admin base view model. We are injecting it in the index view of our application so that we can get access to the different classes or properties of the admin base view model. Our admin base view model consists of different classes and gives us access to different properties of different classes. So when we inject the admin base view model in any view, we will have access to all of these classes that you see that we have added to the admin base view model. If you haven't watched the previous video tutorial, you would not understand why we are using this or why we are injecting this object. So I will recommend you to watch the video tutorial series where we are implementing the uh, admin panel or the home controller view, where we are implementing all these base view models and all the classes associated with it. But for now, all you need to know is that we have injected the admin base view model inside the view so that we can get access to all these properties. And we have instantiated the values using dependency injection. So finally, we will also need a property or a method that will return the partial view, that is the get roles layout. So all these layout that we are going to create, we are going to put it inside a partial view rather than the actual view, so that we can manage it easily in our application. We have done the same for the user roles and the models, sorry, for the all users. We have added these models in different views or partial views. Similarly, we are following the same pattern for the user roles. This view that you see here, we will be adding this view into a partial view and then loading that partial view in the main view. So let's go back to our application. Now let's go ahead and create this partial view. So inside the shared view folder of our views for admin area, we will go ahead and add this get user role layout. So let's go ahead, get roles layout, sorry. So let's go ahead and add this. We are going to select ASP.NET Core and select a layout view file. We will change the name to the name that we are going to use, which is get roles layout. We have added an underscore as the prefix to identify this file as partial layout. That is the naming convention that usually the industry uses. So you can use whatever naming convention you feel is comfortable for you, but I'm going to use an underscore at the beginning of any names that I add to the file as identifying them as partial layout. I'll go ahead and delete these code that I've got by default, and I will add or implement the code that we need to display on the partial layout. So I've added the Bootstrap 4 code that we will use to display the UI in this user roles layout. So we have implemented different models that we are going to use. We are going to have a model to delete any role, a confirmation before we delete the role. We are going to have a model to add a new role. We're going to have a model to update a new role, and we will have a model to view the roles and a model to view the role types. So these are all Bootstrap 4 classes that we have used in HTML to implement these views. So since we are not teaching you any Bootstrap 4 or HTML in this video tutorial series, I recommend you that if you want to learn Bootstrap 4 or HTML, you go and read the official documents from Bootstrap 4 website. So let's go ahead. Now the view is implemented. So we'll focus on implementing the JavaScript methods that we would need to manage the UI. So if we go back to the user roles, when we click these buttons, we see the models loading. When we click these buttons, we can have different actions like adding new roles, deleting or resetting. We can also have the permission type added. So these all need to be added and then displayed onto the tabulated table. So for that, we will be using some JavaScript and some jQuery. So let's go ahead and use that in this application. So let's go back to the application and then go to the user role folder. Let's go ahead and add the custom layout file. We are following the same pattern that we do in all other views. We create a custom layout for our views. So we will add a new file. We will go to ASP.NET Core and then we will choose the layout file. We will name this layout as admin user role layout. Click new, and then we will also need to add a view start file in this folder since we are using a custom layout, so that when this view starts loading, the implementation can find that we are using a custom layout that we have declared for this view. So we'll add a new file. We will go to the ASP.NET Core and search for a view start file. We will not change the name. We will leave it as underscore view start. And here in the view start file, we will change this default layout to our custom layout and provide the path of the file. So now we can close this view start file, and here in the admin user role layout file that we just created, we are going to add the Bootstrap 4 code for the custom layout UI. So now I have added the custom layout code or the Bootstrap 4 code for the UI, which is basically HTML with different classes. And here you will see we have injected the admin base view model, and in the user controller we are injecting this model. So now in the admin base view model we will have access to the site wide setting class, and then we can have access to the remaining properties that we would need, like the website name, the title, the web description and the website author. We are then loading our header style partial view, which loads all the scripts or all the CSS styling files. We have a render section for custom styles. We are loading the sidebar, the top bar and the footer, and we are rendering the body of the view. In the development version, we will be using the non-minified versions of our JavaScript file, and in the production version, we will be using the minified version. Here I have added the image.js JavaScript file which we are going to create. This image.js file is nothing but it's going to keep the code to preview the images or to upload the images in our application, since we'll be using it at multiple places. So we can just add the functions in one file. So we will go ahead and now create this image.js inside the common folder. So let's go ahead and create it. So go to www root library, and then inside of a custom folder we can go to the JS common folder, and here we can add this new file. Let's call this uh, file as image.js. Let's select JavaScript, don't need to provide the extension. Let's go ahead, create it. Now in this image.js file, I have added two functions. One is to preview the image and one is to open the file explorer. Since we are going to use this function at multiple places, I have added it to this file. We have used these functions in previous video tutorials to preview the images and to open file explorer, but here I decided to put it inside one file so that we can access, instead of adding these functions to multiple places, we can just access it from this image.js file. So let's save this and then go back to our user role layout file. Let's save the changes, and that should be it for user role layout, and our image.js file is completed. Now let's go to the admin.js file that we had created, because we need to add some more functions to it. So we can go to the, not the admin.js, but we'll go ahead and add a new file to the admin folder. Inside the admin folder, we are going to create a new JavaScript file for our roles related functionality. So we will call this roles.js or roles, since we have already selected JavaScript file. Now here inside this JavaScript file, we will write all the custom logic that we need to manage the user role section. So here we have implemented all the required jQuery or JavaScript methods that we are going to use to perform the CRUD operations on the user role table. So let's start from the beginning. We use the document.ready shorthand to make sure that when the DOM is ready, we go ahead and load the user roles and all role permissions. If we have any existing roles and permissions that have already been created and been added to our database, then we will go ahead and load them. So if we have any existing new role permissions other than the administrator or the customer or the moderator that we have as default, if there are any other new permissions or role permissions or role that have been created in our application, we want to load them in the table. So we have these two extension methods. So these get user role method, as you see over here, will fetch the existing user roles from the database. So here we are doing some jQuery and Ajax, which will then go ahead and fetch this data from the database. And once the data is fetched, we will stringify the data into JSON, and then we will set this data to the tabulated table. We will initialize our tabulated table calling the table.setData method. Now if you scroll to the initialize the tabulated table comment, here you can see we have the table object, and this table object has been instantiated using the tabulator functions. So I have created the tabulator table with the values that I would need for displaying the different columns in the table. So here is the code for that. We have used the same logic in the all user table as well, where we are displaying the uh, all the users in our application in the tabulator table. where we have set the layout to fit columns. We want the responsive layout to be hidden, tooltips to be shown, and so on. So there are a bunch of settings that are available in Tabulator. So you can initialize your table with the following settings, and you can read the Tabulator documentation from the official website to see what additional settings you can apply on your Tabulator table. So we want to sort the table by the ID and we want to sort it ascending. So we have used the initial sort uh, flag over here. So you can use this flag if you want to initially sort your table. So there are a bunch of settings as I mentioned, and you can go through the documentation. So here are all the columns that we are going to display in the table, and we have a column that is going to contain all our buttons to perform the actions like edit, delete. So that's what this column does. So it's returning some dynamically generated buttons, and we have used some Bootstrap classes to generate these dynamic buttons. So I'm not going to go into details of how you are going to generate this table. You would have to read the documentation if you want to understand this framework, that is Tabulator. But I have the code here for you to start, and you can follow this and do the changes accordingly. Now we have the role permission types method that will load the role permissions. So once again we will perform a Ajax query on our database because we don't want the page to reload, and therefore we are using Ajax. And when we get the data, we will display the data. So now here we have used the swal, or the sweet alert pop-up in case if we have an error. And if we don't have an error, then whatever data we receive, we will set it in this empty role type object that we have created. For now, our object is empty. We have initialized the global variable, but once we get the data, we will fill this with the data we receive. So finally, then we have the other extension methods that we will use. I have put all my comments on the methods so you can understand what method does what in this particular of JavaScript file. So this method is just used to load the model, the permission type model that we have. So if we go back, we have a permission type model, so that's what it does. So wherever I have put comments which tell you that these is used to load models, all it does, it loads the model. There will be certain methods that we will use to add certain functionality. So if we go to the extension method that creates the rows and tables, so here you can see this extension method is used to create rows in your table body. So we have a table and we need to create rows for every user role type that we have in our application. So these rows need to be dynamically generated because we don't know how many roles we have initially when the application loads. So that number can change accordingly when somebody adds a new role or somebody deletes a new role. So we have to generate these rows dynamically based on the total number of roles we receive from our database. So that's what this extension method will do, and it will create the rows dynamically and it will append these rows to your table. Since it's going to be a lengthy code to build these rows, I've put it inside this method and I'm calling this extension method over here in this add or view permission row method. So you can go through the logic of this method, how I have implemented and created the rows dynamically. I've used the row tags and the column tags to do so. So once I have created these rows, I just append them to the existing table. Before appending these rows to the table, I check if the table already has a table body, and if it does not, then first we will go ahead and add the table body tag and then add the rows. So I put my comments here and you can read it. We have another method over here that we use to confirm the deletion of any row. So if any role needs to be deleted, we will ask the admin, do you want to delete this row? And if the admin says go ahead, then we can go ahead and delete it. So it's always good to confirm before any delete operation that if the user actually wants to delete the particular feature from your application. Now we have another extension method that is used to add roles to each permission table. So all it does, it adds role IDs. When we perform the test, I will go through these remaining methods and explain. So these are basically used to edit the role model. Before we load the edit model, we have to load the role data into the model. So we use this extension method. For these are the methods that we are using for our database. Since we have not yet implemented or tested the feature, we cannot test this, but in short, these methods are just calling the database to perform CRUD operations like the delete, add and update role, and create new role permission. If you look inside all these methods that we have, the Ajax method, they are calling an endpoint, which is an API endpoint, and we haven't yet created these API endpoints. We will be creating them once we finish implementing these logic, so that we can test the user role section. So all we need to do is we need to go ahead now and implement these API endpoints. But before we do that, this file that we created, we need to reference it in our view so that this JavaScript file, that is role.js, gets loaded in our view, and our view will have access to all these methods that we created. So let's go to the user roles folder, and here in the user role controller, we are returning the index view. So let's create this index view over here. Now in the index view, we will have to reference this role.js file and make sure it loads. We don't want to reference this role.js file in the admin layout or in the base view. That's because we want this file only to be loaded when somebody accesses the user role view. So therefore we'll only load it in this particular view for user role, not in some other view. So in the index view, first thing, we add a title to the page. Then we will load our partial view, which is the get roles layout. We have already created that, and all the modals are inside this particular layout. So all this layout will do is it will hold all the modal related UI code. So it will add that code inside this container. And we have some styles. We have the Bootstrap 4, the tabulator styling, which we are using for the Bootstrap style. And we have the Sweet Alert CSS file that we are using for the Sweet Alert pop-up. So I need to change this to, so because I had named this wrong, so it's Limonte Sweet Alert 2. So yes, now it's going to load the Sweet Alert file. Also, we are going to load the tabulator. We have already installed these libraries in the previous video tutorial, so we are not going to install it again. So if you have not watched the video tutorials previously, you wouldn't know what we are talking about. This is the tabulator library that we are using, Sweet Alert library that we are using. We have installed it. So when you download the source code, you will already have these in your source code. But if you want to know how to install it, you would have to watch the previous video tutorial. So for the Sweet Alert, let me change this to the correct name of the folder. And here we have also loaded the admin, the role.js file, which is in our admin folder. So looks like everything that we need is now over here. At least a view should load right now because we have all the files that we need. We have referenced it. So let's go and try to see if our view loads before we go ahead and create the API. So let me just run this application. So application is loaded. Let's go to the user roles. We are still getting this error, so we would have to fix this error before we try to load. So let's see what the error is. Says invalid operation exception, the layout view admin areas user role could not be located. So let me go and check this. Yes, the error was, as you can see, that the file that I have, the admin user role layout, it needs to be inside the shared folder, not the user role folder. So I need to move it over here. So now if I try to load this application, it should technically load it, yes. So we have the error, we don't have the error now, but we have an error from our server where the request could not be completed. That's because the if we go to the application and go to the roles.js, so what we are trying to do here, when the view loads initially, we are trying to display the existing roles and permission types in our table. Since we have not yet created the API that is fetching all this data, we are getting this error back and it's being displayed on the server. So we need to create the API endpoints, so when we load this view, we will not get this error. So let's go ahead and create the API endpoints that we will need to load the user roles and permissions. So let's do that. So to implement our controller that we will be using to manage all the APIs related to the user roles, we'll go ahead and add a new controller in the version 1 of our API. We'll add a new file. We'll select ASP.NET Core controller class and we'll call this as user role controller. We'll hit new and then we will go ahead and make some changes in this default file. First, we would need to add the required attributes on our class. For preventing the unauthorized access, we have used the authorized attribute. We will add the missing import statements. And now we have the filter or the attribute for our route, defining the route, how to access this API controller. We have defined this controller as an API controller and the version number for this API controller. Also, the controller class should be inheriting from the controller base. That's because this is an API and it does not have any view. So we are not returning any view. So we'll get rid of this view method that is returning the view, the index method. We will go ahead and then instantiate the required services that we would need in the constructor of our class. But before that, what we are going to do is we are going to create a service in our application to manage all the roles and permissions. So like we always do, we go ahead and create a separate service that we use to manage different functionalities in our application. We are going to create another service. We are going to call this service as role service. So let's go ahead and create it. So let's right click on our project and then add a new project. Select library, class library, make sure it's .NET Core class library. Name this project as role service. Make sure that we create this project inside the project folder that contains all the projects. Click open and then create. We don't need this default class that is created, so we will delete it. We will add a class and interface in our service. So let's add that. We'll select a new class, call this iRole service or SVC. Sorry, this should be an interface, not a class. And then we are going to create a new class called as role service. So let's go ahead and add this class. We make sure that the iRole service is extends or implemented on this role service. And here inside the role service, we will implement all the methods that we would need to manage the roles and role permissions in our application. So here, first thing that we want to do is go ahead and instantiate our required objects. So let's go ahead and do that. So I've added the required objects. For now, we would also need to add references to certain projects. So let's add reference to the model service and also to the data service. So we have added this. We'll click OK. Now the packages are being restored. Once they are restored, we can reference these missing classes, import statement to using data service, and also to the using model service. Now we would need to add certain packages, and the first package that we would need to add is ASP.NET Core Identity.Entity Framework Core. So let's go ahead and add that package. ASP.NET Core.identity.entity framework core. We will choose the latest stable version and we will add the package. We also need to add ASP.NET Core identity. So let's go ahead and add that package. So let's add Microsoft ASP.NET Core.identity latest stable version. And finally, we would need to add the package that is newtonsoft.json. So let's go ahead and add this, the latest stable version. So all the packages are now added successfully. Let's reference or add the missing import statements. So we have now added all the required objects that we would need to be instantiated so that we can use them in our methods. So let's go ahead and start creating the methods. So here I have added all the required methods that we would need. But before I go ahead and start explaining what each method does, let's go ahead and add two model classes that we would need, that is role permission and permission type. So let's go ahead to our model service, which contains all the models in our application. We'll go ahead and add these two new models inside this model service. Let's go ahead and add a new file. Let's call this class as role permission. And inside role permission, we don't need the constructor. And here we will add all the required properties associated with the role permission. Here I have added the properties that we would need and added the reference to component model.data annotations. Please note that at this particular video tutorial series, we will only be using the ID and application role ID, whereas these other methods we won't be using it, or these other properties we won't be using it at this point. But yes, we will be using it in the future tutorial series or the phases of this CMS application that we are building. Therefore, I have added these properties. So if there are certain properties in any model classes that you see which I have not used, it means that we will be using them in the upcoming or future video tutorial series for this CMS application. So the next class that we would need to add is the permission type. So let's go ahead and add the permission type. In the permission type, we would just need two properties, one for the ID of the permission type and one for its type, what kind of permission it is. So we will just need two properties here, and we will add reference to data annotations because we want to specify the ID as the primary key. So let's close these files and go back to the role service. Here in the role service, we have the first method which is returning all the roles in our application. So we would here need to go ahead and create these application role object as well in our DB set so that we can query it. This application role object that we are querying, it's going to be inheriting from our identity role, which is part of ASP.NET Core identity. So we would first go ahead and create the model or extend our identity role class so that we can have additional properties in it like we did for the application user. So I'm going to add a new file, call this as application role in the model service, and I'm going to make sure this class extends the identity role. I will add the missing reference to ASP.NET Core identity. I don't need the constructor, and I have added the following properties here that I would need. I have just extended the existing identity role class from ASP.NET Core identity. This is the class that creates the role tables in ASP.NET users that we have in our database for ASP.NET users, this is the class that will create all the roles and store it in the appropriate tables. So we are extending this class to add some additional properties that we would need, like the role name, role icon, the handle, and if the role is active, and the permission types that we are going to create. So I've just extended this class with the following properties. So now we will go and add this application role object to the DB set so that the new table is created and it's extended. So I'll go back to the data service application DB, and here we would have to use this in the DB set since we are going to query it to get the details. So let's go ahead and add it over here. So here I have added the application role DB set. I have used the plural naming convention. I've called it application roles. So now if I go back to the role service, I'll have application roles without any errors. I can access it, and I should have reference to entity framework core so that I can use the include method. So when I use the include method, I can include the permission table as well that is attached to this particular application role. So now what we want to do in this particular method is we want to get all the roles that we have in our application, and this method is going to return that. It is going to query the application role and include the permissions as well for each role. So the next method that we have added over here is to add the roles to our table. So first thing that we would need to do is the form data that we receive. We need to deserialize it and convert it into an application role object, and therefore we have used Newtonsoft. We have installed the package. Once we have deserialized this, we will loop through each permissions that we have, and we will add those permissions to our table. But before adding that, in our application we are also adding some images to each roles in our application. So if you have been using certain websites, you would notice that sometimes, like in forums, each role will have, some roles have certain images associated with the roles. So in case if we want to add an icon or an image to a role, we can use that, and we can attach that in the form data, the appropriate images. So we would once again need to check if the incoming request has any images, and if it has any images, then we would need to add those images to our server or store them in our server and store the image path in our database. It's the same process we are following what we did for the profile image of users. We store the image on our server and we store the path for that image in the database table. So here we would have to add the missing reference to system.io, and here we are going to create the icon and store the icon path in the database. Finally, we will store the application role object to our database and save the changes. So the delete role async, as the name suggests, will delete the role permissions. Since we have created the role permissions, we would also need to add it to our application DB set so we can perform the CRUD operation on it. So we will go ahead and add the role permission, and we will use the plural naming convention over here. So here we can add or delete any roles in our application or role permissions. I will explain to you what role permission means and what role type means. So we'll look at it in detail when we test the user role section. For now, it might be a bit confusing that why we have role and why we have role permission. So you will understand it when we look at the UI when we try to test it. So we have a method to update the role. So when we update the role, we can update the permissions of the role, and I have created a method for that as well. And this method will be used to implement that logic. We have another method to get all the role permissions, because we need to display the role permissions in the JavaScript file that we created. When we are initially loading, we are loading all roles and role permissions. So we would need this method to load all the role permissions. And if we want to delete any role permission, we can use the delete role permission method. All we need to do is pass the permission ID. Finally, we have another method to get the role permission, the permission types of each role. And therefore, to get these permission types, we also would need to add it to our DB set. And when we create these permission types, we will also need to store these permission types. So we will go ahead and add this permission type. Go back over here, and then we have this permission type that we can get. So now we have added the model classes to our DB set. We would need to regenerate our migrations so these new tables can be created so that we can test our user roles by adding the data to these new tables and try to perform the CRUD operations. And then I will also explain how these role types and permission works and why I have used these two different tables in the application. So when the application is loaded, so the next thing that we would want to do before we close the role service is add the references to all these methods in the interface so that we can access them. So I've added all the references to the methods that we have implemented in the role service in the interface. So now we will have access to these methods in the user controller API that we are creating. All we need to do is instantiate this iRole service object. We'll be using dependency injection to inject the role service in the controller, and to use dependency injection we would need to add this role service to the middleware of our application. So we can add this role service here just below the user helper service. Once again, there is no order to add it. You can add it however you like or at whichever position in this file. I'll go ahead and also add the missing reference to the project. So once we have added the references, now we can add the import statement to the using role service project, and then we should have no errors. Let's go back to the user controller, and here in the user controller we are going to instantiate the role service using dependency injection. So let's do it. So all we need in this particular API controller is the role service. I've instantiated it. Now we will add the required endpoints that we are going to use, that we have used in the role.js file that we created. Using Ajax, we are calling all these endpoints, so we have to implement them. So let's go ahead and quickly implement them. So I have added the required endpoints that we would be using in this roles service or the user role controller. We require a get roles endpoint. So that's an action method which is of type HTTP get. It's an HTTP get request. We will be fetching all the roles from the database. We have already implemented the get roles async method in the role service. So we will be calling that method, and whatever data we receive, we will be passing back that data to the client. We then have the add role, which we will be using this endpoint to add a new role to this user role table that we created. Then we have the update role method, which will be used to update the existing role. This is the endpoint that will be calling the update role method that we have in the role service. This will be a HTTP put method because we will use put if we want to edit any data. Then we have a delete method that will be used to delete any role, as we will be calling the delete role async method from a role service, and all we need to do is pass the role ID to perform the deletion. Finally, we have the post get method for the role permission. So we need to create a new role permission in our application. We can use this method or endpoint. We can get all the role permission using the HTTP get all role permissions method. All these methods that we have implemented are calling the methods that we created inside the role service. So that's why we have only one service implemented over here or instantiated. Finally, we want to delete any role permission, role type. We will go ahead and we will use this method. So that's all we need to do in this particular endpoint. So it's standard code that we have used over here to implement the endpoints, and accordingly we have implemented the attributes like post get depending on the actions that we want to perform on the associated tables. So our endpoints are now created. So a jQuery or a JavaScript file, when tries to communicate to these endpoints, we should not see any errors in the fetching of these endpoints or the data. So let's try to build our application first to make sure that we don't have any errors. So our build was successful. We don't have any errors. So 0 errors. We have some warnings, but we can ignore that. And we would now go ahead and do the thing that is to delete our migrations folder, because we need to recreate our migrations. Now when we recreate our migrations, our user will be created once again in our table. So let's go ahead and run the migration command. Before we do that, in the functional service of our application, here in the functional service, we have a method that says get default profile pic. Since we have now implemented the profile pic logic in our application, previously I was returning an empty string. Now we will return the actual path of the default profile pic. So whenever new users are created or the default users are created, they will have a default profile image. So let's implement this method before we go ahead and recreate our migrations. So now here I have implemented the logic to create the default or to fetch the default profile pic. We already have a default profile pic inside the root folder. We have created the folder inside the uploads, and inside user profile we have a default folder which contains the default profile pic. We will make a copy of this pic or this picture, and then we will recreate this picture with a new name and store it inside the profile uh, uh, picture folder for all the users. We are not going to use the same profile picture. We are going to make a copy with a new name and use it. So that's what this code does. It gets the default profile picture from the folder, makes a copy of it, then creates the copy, stores it in the profile folder with a new name, and it will be used for the default users in our application. Since we need access to the server's location path for the folder, we have to add the reference to iHosting environment and then instantiate it using dependency ingestion. We will also need reference to system.io for the path. So I have referenced these two using import statements over here. Now the next thing that we do is we will rebuild it once again, or then we can run the migrations command, so that when we run the application we will have the default profile pic for the user created. We can also go ahead and delete the uh, we have an error here. Let's just check. Okay, let me just check. Okay, yeah, I'm sorry, because I changed this default profile pic, so I need to make sure I await for this over here, because this is now an asynchronous task. So that's what the error was. So let me remove this to do method comment. Let me go ahead and also, I think I have used it at two places, for default user and for admin, so I have to change it over here as well. So let me just remove this. So we had put a flag that we had to do this before, after we have implemented the profile pic logic. So now let's go ahead and build this. Or actually stop. I've canceled the build. Let's go ahead and first go to the root folder and delete any default images that we have, so we don't have additional files in our folders for the previous test that we did. So I'm going to delete all these images that we created, because we're going to recreate this. So now I'm going to build this project. So this project is building, no errors, build was fine. So let's go to Azure Data Studio and delete our previous database, because when we try to recreate it we will get an error that already a database with that name exists. So we will log in to our database, and we will go to database. We will run a new query on the local host, and we will drop database CMS, and we will drop database data protection. So we'll go ahead and run these two commands. Now these commands were executed successfully, so let's refresh, and the databases have now been deleted. So we can go ahead and recreate them. So first thing that we would want to do is we will want to go ahead and open the terminal for the project and then type in the following command, which is .NET EF migrations, add name of the migration, initial create, and for which particular context you want to generate this migration. So the context flag and the context name will be application DB context. So we will go ahead and we will hit enter. So the migrations will be generated. So the migrations have been generated. As you can see that we have an undo. If you want to undo this action, we can run the following command, but we don't want to undo it. So now let's go ahead and rerun this command, but with a different context. And the context that we want to run it on is data protection keys context. So we have two context classes in this application that we are building. The data protection key context is used to store all the keys. So let's go ahead and hit enter, and now it will generate the migration file for this particular context. So the build was succeeded, the context file was generated. If we go back to our project, look at the project, we have a new migrations folder. We have the data protection key context folder, and we have the application DB context migration file created as well with all the code that we need to generate the tables. Now it's time to test to recreate the files and folders. So let's go ahead and run our application, the logic that we have already implemented. If we run the application, the migrations will be created. The tables in our database will be created. So our project loaded fine. There was no errors. So if we go and check the database, we should have these two databases created for us. So let's refresh, and now we should have these two databases recreated. So the logic that we have implemented, when the project runs, we do an initial check. If the database doesn't exist, then we go ahead and create it. If you have not watched the initial videos of this tutorial series, you have missed a lot. So please go ahead and watch the video tutorial where we create the database in this application. So now we have the tables created. So we would have to check if we have the, yes, we have the role permissions, the permission types created for us. So we will have access to these tables. Now let's go ahead and go to the application and try to see if we can load this application. We would be logged out because we don't have any previous tokens. So I would have to log in with the default admin.test at 123 default password. Let's log in. We were able to log in, so everything worked fine. As you can see, now we have a default profile image as well for the user that was created. We have implemented the code. So anytime the users are now created, we will have a default profile image for these users, and that was implemented. The users have been marked active. Now we want to work on the user roles. So we would have to go ahead and test this. We would have to check if we can add the user roles and the user permission type. This video is now become very lengthy, and we want to test this, and I also want to explain to you what is this roles and permission types. So I will do it in the next video tutorials. If you have not found this video quite useful because I did not explain a lot, that's because there was a lot of code and I would need to explain it through the UI. So now the UI is implemented. When we try to add the roles and permission types, I will explain to you in detail why we needed these two tables and why we implemented this logic. So it will be more clear. But all the source code is available in the DevOps repo. You can go through the code, understand it, and if you have any questions, use the comment section. I will be happy to answer your questions. And Do not forget to like and subscribe, as I keep repeating that this particular code takes a lot of time to write these lines of code, and all I'm asking is a like and subscribe. Thank you once again.